Hello, and welcome to the One Seattle Plan Zoning Update online information session. This is the last of a series of information sessions we've been doing. My name is Brennan Staley. I'm with the Office of Planning and Community Development. I'm also joined here by Michael Hubner in our office as well as Sefriana and Patrick will be helping with questions as they come in. So the purpose of this event is to give information about the proposal and then answer questions from you. One, it's important to note that this session will be recorded and it will be shared on our website after the event. The format will be that we'll do a presentation followed by questions and answers. Questions can be posted at any time using the Q&A button. You can click on that and add questions. You can also give thumbs up to other people's questions if you want those to be answered. When we get to the Q&A period, we'll start in the order of which questions have the most thumbs up. We do have a chat function that is for messaging staff about technical issues. And we will not be taking comments at this meeting, but comments can be submitted on our website, zoning.oneseattleplan.com. And again, we are looking for comments until Friday, December 20th. So we're going to start with a little background on the comp plan and why we're doing this, and then move into specifics of the growth strategy, the proposal for updating neighborhood residential zones, and the zoning maps. So what is the comprehensive plan? It's a 20-year plan for growth and a vision for the future of Seattle. It's a way that it guides coordinated action amongst multiple city departments, and we update this once about every 10 years. And we're calling the current update the One Seattle Plan. Importantly, the One Seattle Plan has a wide variety of goals and policies, but also includes a growth strategy that guides where we expect more housing growth will occur over the next 20 years, and that's implemented through zoning legislation. So why are we doing this? The Seattle region does not have enough housing for our current residents and is expected to grow significantly over the next 20 years. Zoning is one of the major barriers that limit the type and amount of housing that can be built. And so we need to address that in order to address this larger issue. And increasing the supply and diversity of housing can achieve many goals that we're trying to do. It can support economic opportunity and mobility. Currently, about a fifth of Seattle renters spend more than half of their income on housing. By increasing the supply of housing, we can help reduce the competition for that limited housing that is driving up our housing prices. And we can also help people access more wealth building opportunities through home ownership. It can also address one of the root causes of homelessness. A study by the University of Washington faculty member Greg Colburn found that the cost of housing is the fundamental driver of homelessness, both in Seattle and cities across this country. So addressing housing cost is a necessary aspect of addressing homelessness. It can also create more inclusive neighborhoods by providing a greater diversity of housing in neighborhoods throughout Seattle. It means that more people can find housing that works for them and they can stay in the communities they love as their needs change over time. It can reduce regional sprawl and greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation is the single largest aspect of our region's contribution to greenhouse gases. And so when people can live near transit and amenities, they travel much less than they would otherwise. And lastly, this can help businesses attract and retain employees. Businesses also pay the high cost of housing since they need to pay their employees more to afford that housing. And so by making housing more accessible, we can help those businesses as well. So we started this process of updating the comprehensive plan in early 2022. We've gone through a number of different phases, working on environmental impacts scoping, initial kind of blue sky, higher level engagement. We developed a draft plan. That draft plan then came out in March of 2024. We had another round of public engagement. And now we're at the point where a final plan, an EIS, is proposed to be sent to council in either late December or early January 2025. And because that plan is now going to council, we are pivoting to work on implementing it through multiple things, including changes to zoning. In terms of the timeline going forward, obviously we're looking for feedback right now on a wide variety of things. then we are going to start bringing things to council for their consideration. We're going to bring that to council in 3 phases. The first phase will be legislation that will update neighborhood residential zones and implement numerous changes that are required to meet with new state law. The next phase of legislation will be rezones for new neighborhood centers, new and expanded regional and urban centers, and around select frequent transit routes. We're also going to be doing a phase 3, where we'll consider some additional rezones in existing regional and urban centers. So the materials we put out in October are drafts of both the we'll go into phase 1 and phase 2 legislation. The phase 1 legislation we look to transmit to City Council in March of 2025, with the idea that they might then be able to adopt it in June of 2025. The phase 2 legislation would be sent to Council in May of 2025, with the idea they might adopt that by September of 2025. And then phase 3 will be a later phase. We have not done any work on that. There is no proposal available. Right now, we are proposing to begin the scoping of that in the fall of 2025, so that council, basically kind of after council adopts the first 2 phases. However, we've heard a lot of comments from the public that maybe we should move that more quickly, and so we are considering those as well. So in October, we released the mayor's recommended growth strategy, which is going to be included in the final plan that will go to council shortly. And then we also released 3 other pieces that we're looking for public feedback until December 20th. The updated neighborhood residential zoning, legislation to implement that, and phase 2 legislation, and then the draft zoning maps. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael now to talk a little bit about the growth strategy, and then we'll continue with some other things.
Thank you, Brennan. Can you go to the next slide, please? So I'm going to briefly describe the growth strategy that is the mayor's vision for to be included in the comprehensive plan that sets a roadmap for how the city intends to accommodate housing and job growth over the next 20 years. This updated growth strategy is built on a set of what we call place types. There are different types of locations or districts across the city that have different roles in accommodating either housing or employment growth. There are regional centers, urban centers, neighborhood centers, urban neighborhoods, manufacturing and industrial centers, industrial areas outside of centers, major institutions, and parks and open spaces and cemeteries are also identified on the map. Next slide, please, Brandon. The key place types to keep in mind, especially with respect to their role in accommodating housing, and where the major emphasis of this plan has been in increasing the housing capacity that is created through zoning that implements these place types, are shown on this slide. Regional centers, previously in our existing comprehensive plan, they're called urban centers. We're renaming them to regional centers, reflecting their regional importance as our densest areas with a mix of housing, office, retail, entertainment, and access to regional transit. And they get a regional designation through the Puget Sound Regional Council. Urban centers are also dense locations located around major transit access with a citywide role in providing housing, jobs, and shops and services. They also receive a designation regionally by the Growth Management Planning Council. Previously, we called those urban villages. We have a new place type called neighborhood center. These are smaller areas with a mix of shops and goods and services and employment, but especially new moderate density housing options around a commercial core and or access to frequent transit. Then finally, with respect to planning for future housing needs, we have our urban neighborhood place type. And these are all of the areas outside of our centers. 2 important things are going on inside the urban neighborhoods. One is a new neighborhood residential zone. We have an existing good zone called neighborhood residential It is being completely updated to allow a mix of attached and detached housing, including duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and sixplexes, a variety of attached housing options, including stacked flats as well, with limited commercial activity, but importantly, including the option, excuse me, for corner stores across the urban neighborhoods. The other factor that, or major change in zoning, which we'll be talking about shortly in urban neighborhood, is zoning changes along our frequent transit arterials to allow a diverse mix of low and moderate density housing and commercial uses. We also have manufacturing, industrial centers, but they're extremely limited housing options in those areas. Next slide, please. So in sum, the revised growth strategy, and there was a draft that was released to the public in last spring. We received quite a bit of public comment on that draft, and there were some changes between the spring and the fall release. And in sum, there are 7 regional centers that are proposed. They're shown in the dark blue on this map, and 24 urban centers, also more of a navy blue color on the map. The regional centers include Ballard as a new designation as a regional center, a new urban center around the anticipated Northeast 130th Street light rail station in North Seattle, that's shown in a hatched blue pattern at the top of the map, an expansion of existing urban and regional centers around light rail stations, and filling in an area that was undesignated in Squire Park, and in several other areas where existing centers were quite small. There are 30 neighborhood centers shown on the map. That is several more than were released in last spring. There are 29 new neighborhood centers, and one of our urban villages has been redesignated as a neighborhood center at South Park. And finally, the urban neighborhood, and as I mentioned before, this is where the new neighborhood residential would accommodate middle housing options consistent with new state law, and also upzones along frequent transit arterials. Next slide. So for those of you who have been paying attention since the spring, what are the key differences since the draft that we received public comment on in the spring? Most important, there are 5 new neighborhood centers among the 30 in all. The expansions of First Hill Capitol Hill Regional Center and 23rd Union and Jackson Urban Center into the Squire Park area is new as well. And the redesignation of South Park from currently an urban village. In the spring draft, it was shown as an urban center. It has been, that status has changed to a neighborhood center, and the area that's covered within those boundaries is smaller, although there are some zoning changes that are in the proposal that was released this fall for South Park. Next slide. And Brennan, I think I'm turning it back over to you. And you're on mute.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the proposal for updating neighborhood residential zones. The brief context is that there was a state law passed last year, HB 1110. It requires cities throughout Washington state to allow a wider variety of housing types, such as duplexes, triplexes, apartments, fourplexes, and also limits how we can regulate housing in those areas. Really briefly, we're updating the development standards consistent with that. So one, we are moving towards a density as the way of limiting the number of units on a lot. We're allowing 1 unit per 1,250 square feet of lot, so about 4 units on an average 5,000 square foot lot, except that consistent with state law, at least 4 units will be allowed on all lots, regardless of lot size, and 6 will be allowed within a quarter-mile walk of major transit, or if 2 are affordable. There are, however, some provisions that limit that in environmentally critical areas. The major way we limit the size of buildings is through a floor area ratio. The amount of floor area allowed on a lot is calculated by multiplying the floor area ratio by the size of a lot. So for example, on a 5,000 square foot lot, an FAR of 1 would mean that the buildings in total could have 5,000 square feet of floor area. So similar to the existing rules and what was proposed in March, the floor area would vary based on the number of units. So you get more floor area if you have more units. However, we think Different than what was released in the spring, we're proposing a maximum floor area of 1.2 FAR. That's generally enough so that on a 5,000 square foot lot, you could have 4 units that were each 3 bedrooms. We will also have the footprint of the buildings is limited by lot coverage, and so the footprint of those buildings couldn't take up more than 50% of the lot. We're proposing to slightly change the height limit for what is 30 feet today with it plus a pitched roof of 5 feet to 32 feet plus a pitched roof of 5 feet. Both of those will tend to result in 3-story buildings, but that slight increase is in order to make nicer floor to ceiling heights for buildings that are not directly at grade. We're also proposing a minimum open space or amenity area requirement of 20% of the lot area. And lastly, we're changing the setbacks in order to recognize this new features above. The front setbacks would be reduced to 10 feet. The rear setbacks would be 10 feet if there's no alley, sorry, if there is an alley, without an alley, and 0 feet if there is an alley. Accessory dwelling units would continue to be allowed to be located within 5 feet of a rear alley. And then the side setbacks would stay at 5 feet. We're also proposing a couple bonuses, cases where people could get more density or floor area in certain circumstances. One is that for stacked flats, such as apartments or condos that are located within a quarter mile of frequent transit and are lots 6,000 square feet or greater, they could have a slightly higher FAR of 1.4 instead of 1.2. and a higher density of 1 unit per 650 square feet. So that would be, for example, on a 6,000 square foot lot, you could have 9 units or 3 per floor. We're also proposing a bonus for affordable housing in buildings where at least half the units are affordable, and that would be restricted to certain income and only available for people making certain incomes, and that would be set for a 50-year period. They would be allowed to have a height limit of 4 stories rather than 3, a lot coverage of 60% rather than 50, a maximum density of 1 unit per 4,000 square feet, and a higher floor area ratio of 1.8 instead of 1.2. Given the high bar for the number of units that would be affordable, we expect this would be used exclusively by nonprofit developers that are getting subsidies from the city. We're also proposing to allow small-scale commercial uses, such as restaurants and retail stores. These would be proposed to be allowed in any corner lot throughout neighborhood residential and multifamily zones. They would, however, have to meet certain, they couldn't be more than 1,500 square feet and 1,500 square feet in size. They also would have certain limits on hours of operation, noise and odor, and screening and location of solid waste and other activities. Here, we did ask Makers Architecture to develop some examples of what this might look like. Here are 3 examples what this might result in. We have a document called Updating Seattle's Neighborhood Residential Zones that has more, that shows a much wider variety, especially of parking configurations, etc. On the left shows an example of what would happen if people build 3 units on a 5,000 square foot lot. They would have a slightly lower floor area at that density. In the middle shows what it looks like if 4 units, maximizing the FAR for attached units, would look like with parking off an alley in the rear. And lastly, the one on the right shows what it looks like on a 6,000 square foot lot if you use that stacked flat bonus. We're also proposing to change off-street parking requirements. Today, no parking is required in centers that are near frequent transit. You can see those areas in blue. Consistent with state law, no parking would be required within a half mile of light rail and bus rapid transit stops. That's currently required for what they call middle housing, and we propose to apply that to other types of housing as well. Outside of these areas, the requirement would be 1 space per 2 principal dwelling units, and accessory dwelling units would continue to be exempt from parking requirements. Additionally, we're proposing to we have draft zoning maps that would show where we're proposing to change the zone from neighborhood residential or other zones to new zones. We're proposing rezones in 3 types of areas. one in the 24 new neighborhood centers, in existing regional and urban centers where we're proposing center expansions, as well as along frequent transit routes. So we do have online interactive maps that allow you to look at those. You can click on a site and it'll give you details. It also will show you pictures and give you links to where you can get more information. It's also very easy to read at a high level what the proposal is. Areas that are in gray are proposed not to change. Areas that would remain in neighborhood residential zoning are that lighter yellow. And then other areas would be multifamily would be brown, and it would be commercial mixed use would be orange. I do want to point out briefly, the size of the neighborhood centers is based on generally what can be you can walk to within about a 4-minute walk, about 1,000 square feet of a center. These are pretty small areas, so there's a more limited range of zones, from mostly 4 to 6 stories. Because regional and urban centers are larger, there's more transitions in those areas, so they have zones that range from 3 to 8 stories. And then because the frequent transit routes are fairly small, they tend to have are mostly a 5-story zone. But again, you can get much more detailed information online on our maps. We are looking for feedback on the changes in neighborhood residential zones and the rezones until this Friday, December 20th. There's obviously a lot more information on our website at zoning.oneseattleplan.com. Lastly, we are proposing a third phase. We're going to revisit zoning in existing regional and urban centers. We're proposing that work will begin in 2025, and then there will be additional public engagement throughout that process. That work is also coordinated with ongoing sub-area planning for regional centers. We currently are working on 3 sub-area plans for regional centers. We'll be doing more in the coming years, as well as stationary planning around the station areas that will be part of Sound Transit 3. So if you are looking for more resources or you want the opportunity to comment, please go to zoning.oneseattleplan.com. The commenting period will close at the very end of the day on December 20th, this Friday. You can also email questions if you have them after this event to oneseattleplan.zoning@seattle.gov. So at this point, we're going to stop the presentation and we're going to turn it over to the public for questions. So again, please, you can post questions at any time using that Q&A button. Please click on it and you'll submit it. And we will now kind of go through them, Michael and myself. So thank you very much. Okay. So the first question is about trees. Portland, Oregon has promoted specific tree retention and tree planting areas with density changes. Why aren't we? Oregon has required 4plexes on lots since 2022, but has saved many large trees. Yes. So the question is about why not update our tree protection and other regulations. So the city just completed a process of going through our tree regulations. So we have 4 types of tree regulations. We have tree protection code, which regulates which trees have to be preserved during development and outside of development. It also requires planting or paying into a fund for trees if you do take down trees. We also have tree planting requirements in all of our zones. Those include green factor in some higher density zones or tree requirements in lower density zones that require new tree planting. We also have street tree requirements that both limit the removal of street trees and also require planting with new development as well. And then we have the Environmentally Critical Areas Code, which has stricter rules for environmentally critical areas. So in 2023, we just completed a process of updating most of those standards. And so we didn't want to kind of restart that process immediately after having completed it. One place where we are proposing changes is with the neighborhood residential tree planting requirements. Currently, they're pretty kind of old approach that's very convoluted and really encourages the planting of smaller species trees. And so we are updating that to encourage the planting of larger species trees as well. Okay, the next question. Mayor Herod's plan creates 330,000 new units. The Growth Management Planning Council says Seattle needs 80,000 units. Why is the city going beyond HB 1110 and creating 4 times the number of units? And where can I find a breakdown of the new units per zoning proposal? Mike, would you be able to answer that one?
Yeah, I can take that on. So the Growth Management Planning Council, and this is under a framework established by the Growth Management Act, does set housing targets for each of the cities in King County. That's a 25-year target, actually, that is set at 112,000 units as a minimum for the city of Seattle. We did adjust that number to reflect some recent development, and we estimate that for the 20-year planning period that this plan covers, 2024 to 2044, that minimum number is about 80,000 units. That our housing target is just one of the things that we look at in designing the plan and identifying alternatives for the growth strategy, and what flows from that are the zoning proposals we're talking about tonight. And there are a range of factors that we identified early and throughout the process that support and suggest the need to plan for much more housing than the target would, the minimal target sets at 80,000. One of those is the rate of job growth compared with housing growth that the city has seen over the past decade, and job growth has exceeded our housing growth. That's one of the factors that's feeding into our housing affordability crisis, with prices and rents going up faster than many people can pay. Another is the increase in housing prices and rents itself as an indicator that we are not providing a sufficient supply of housing, especially that meets the needs of households across the city. So this plan is designed to provide more than the 80,000. It is not specifically designed to see the city grow by 330,000 new units. That number refers to our capacity for housing. So our capacity for housing is a theoretical number of how many housing units the city could accommodate under the new zoning proposal. We don't expect all of those properties to redevelop during the next 20 years, but we feel it's important to provide many choices for market rate and for affordable housing developers to find sites to build the housing we need over the next 20 years. And we feel that need is going to greatly exceed the 80,000. And we know that too, based on our past experience where similar numbers, similar targets we've had previously, after we adopted the plan, the city continued to grow much faster than the numbers that the Growth Management Planning Council gave us. So this is a plan oriented around housing supply, and we intend to provide it. And 330,000 we feel is a good number to aim for.
Great. The next one is about the state's rules. So the state's model ordinance says that the provisions of this ordinance do not apply to a lot that has been created through splitting of a single residential lot. Does that mean a 10,000 square foot lot cannot be split in two, creating 2 lots that can each have 4 units? Yeah, so first of all, the state's model ordinance is actually not the state law. It is rather a ordinance that cities can choose to adopt in whole, or that cities, if they do not do their own adoption, will automatically have enacted. However, it is kind of consistent with the state law, and that state law says that all units, every lot in certain areas has to be allowed to have at least 4 units per lot, with some exemptions for ECAs. But it says that if you split a lot, then each of those new lots don't also have to be allowed to have 4 units. Cities are required to allow them to be split, but just because you take a lot that could have 4, splitting it doesn't mean you get 4 more units on each of those lots. Okay, the next question. I hear that the proposal has maybe an opportunity for modification based on public feedback. Are there specific sections open to modifications, or is the entire proposal open for feedback? Yeah, so we certainly are looking for comments on anything. We're not limiting where we might have feedback and make changes at this point. You know, right now, obviously, we already had previous ones were based on the comp plan. Generally, that comp plan is now getting ready to move to council, and we're looking for feedback on the zoning update. But as it relates to the zoning update, yeah, we're accepting feedback on all parts of it. There are not certain things that are off limits. Okay. The tree point system allows for 33% less trees on a 4-unit lot than on a single family dwelling unit. As most of the city's residential neighborhoods are lots that are being zoned for 4 units, won't that result in a long-term 30% decrease in residential tree coverage? So first of all, to be clear, to people who aren't familiar with the tree point system, is the basic idea is that you have to achieve a certain number of tree points. You get can achieve more points for planting larger species trees or preserving trees, and that is really intended to encourage the planting not just of small species trees. The way that we did a bunch of modeling to look at both what is a kind of reasonable number of trees to put on these lots, and also what that would result in terms of canopy cover. In doing that work, it was clear that on trees on sites that underdevelop, there's more room for trees and it's easier to ask for more. And so that the idea is that under this proposal, if you underdevelop a property, you actually have to plant more trees. So the question is, won't that result in a long-term 33% decrease in residential tree coverage? So no, obviously it does mean that on lots that have more density, we might get fewer trees, and on lots that are developing at a lower density, we might get more trees. But I guess, so it could be relative to those two. It doesn't necessarily mean that the overall tree canopy would increase or decrease by a specific number. Okay, the next one is also about trees. How can we encourage designs that retain mature trees? The current tree ordinance is useless in this regard. Preserving trees will be critical for such high density. So obviously, one thing we do is actually we require the retention of mature trees in certain cases. The tree protection code requires type 2 trees to be preserved in certain cases, not all cases. There's a balance there. For neighborhood residential zones, it had to be preserved unless we would not be able to meet the lot coverage of 50% without removing a tree. We also encourage the retention of mature trees by having some development standard flexibility. If you preserve a tree, you can reduce your front and rear yards if it would help to preserve a tree. You can also waive, that's type 2 trees. We can also waive parking if it would help to preserve a tier 2 tree. So those are some things we're doing. Obviously, designers can do a lot to preserve trees on their own property. But if there are other things that you think we should consider, please do submit that as a comment, and we would like to hear that. Okay. So another one here I can take on neighborhood residential zones. There's a lot coverage of 50%, and there's also a requirement of 20% of open space. What happens to the other 30% of the lot? So the lot coverage is just the limits of the footprint of the buildings. And then the open space have to be a certain size, and they can't have driveways or parking or solid waste storage, the required bicycle parking. The minimum size dimensions also mean it can't be in a 5-foot setback. So generally what you would see is those things that are, that 30% could include driveways, it could include parking spaces, include the side setbacks, but also it could include things that look a lot like open space or amenity area as well. It'll depend on the design of the building. So Michael, I'm going to ask here one for you. With so many more people in Magnolia, how will the city afford increased transportation, the need for fire and police staffing? And healthcare here in Magnolia is limited, yet there is no plan for a larger clinic or the space to build one. These are needs and expensive resources.
Yeah, so let me first talk citywide, what we're doing in the comprehensive plan and what the city generally does to align investments and plans for the services and the infrastructure that we need as we grow with that growth. That is a core purpose of the comprehensive plan, is not only to identify places where we are planning for new growth in housing and jobs, but also there are more than a dozen chapters in the comprehensive plan dealing with issues like capital facilities, like utilities, like transportation, parks and open space. We work very closely with the departments that provide those services and infrastructure. They work in partnership with us to design this plan. We provide the information about the locations and amount of growth that we anticipate over the next 20 years to them and do the more detailed work, the plan for the services and investments they make. They use the locations of housing that would likely result from the kind of the zoning proposal that we are discussing this evening. With respect to Magnolia, there are several areas identified for additional housing in Magnolia. I would not describe it as significant as more than other areas. In fact, it's a bit of a lighter touch comparing Magnolia to other locations in the city. They're planned for growth. There are two proposed neighborhood centers. There's a small amount of area is zoned around the transit arterials for some additional density. And then there's also the change to neighborhood residential to allow the flexes, as Brennan has been. Overall, the population increase that would result in Magnolia is really fairly small compared with the existing population. But even with that increase, that's information that goes to the service providers in the city when they're planning for what we're going to need as the city and as Magnolia grows. But I would not describe it in any way as a very significantly large increase in population for Magnolia as a neighborhood, given the proposal on the table.
Thank you. And Michael, you're becoming a little bit glitchy. You might want to consider just turning off your camera for a little bit.
Yeah, thanks for letting me know.
Great. Next question. My garage is accessed through my neighbor's driveway, and there's an easement on the title that provides me permanent action. If I short plat my lot, is my neighbor required to allow access to the new lots? So that is actually really a question based on the easement, the standards in the easement itself. Generally, though, easements of that sort will guarantee access kind of generally without saying anything about whether more people, if there might be more units, et cetera. So you'd have to look at your specific easement, but that generally would be allowed. Next question is part of the state's mandatory code to decrease the width of parking spaces? What is the city's current parking space width? What is the state's mandated maximum width required? So there is actually a bill that was passed recently at the state level that put certain limits on how cities can regulate parking. One of those was to say that we couldn't require parking spaces that were greater than 8 feet in width and also a certain depth. This I don't think was primarily targeting Seattle. This is probably targeting especially more suburban jurisdictions where they have very wide parking space widths. I think the idea there was just to ensure there's some more flexibility so that the parking space width didn't, in addition to the other parking requirements, didn't require huge spaces. The city has different standards in different cases. We have a small, a medium, and a large space. The small spaces and medium, I believe, have 8 feet width already, and it's only the larger spaces that are 8.5. And so obviously as part of this, we're going to have to change the width of those larger spaces to comply with state law. Next, please explain how neighborhood residential applies to lots with deed restrictions or neighborhoods with restrictions. Where can I find all neighborhoods or lots with that covenants that are exempted from neighborhood residential zones or zoning? So, the city, obviously, with on any individual lot, if you want to redevelop, you both have to meet the city's requirements and any deed restrictions you have on your property. The city actually does not record those deed restrictions. We do not have a comprehensive database of them. And we are not the enforcer of those either. So if you, it is true that there are many lots that have deed restrictions that prevent that. So if there is no single source of where those are, the way you can look at them is apply to the King County assessor to get look at the title on a specific property. But there's no map that shows that kind of is takes that part of titles and puts them on a map. The next question, will there be any neighborhood residential zoning within urban centers? No, we are not proposing. Today, there's no NR zones, although there is some residential small lot, which is considered a neighborhood residential zone. And we are proposing to rezone those existing residential small lots. The residential small lot is going away as a zone, and they would be rezoned to low-rise 1. So there wouldn't be any NR or RSL zones within urban centers. The next question, my neighbor and I have a substantial side yard setback, 3 feet total. Oh, a substandard, my apology. My neighbor and I have a substandard side yard setback, 3 feet total, 6 feet total, 3 on each side of our fence. We are in a proposed neighborhood village, which I assume means neighborhood center. If I want to redevelop, do I need to build the new standard setback, or can I continue to build to the existing footprint of 3 feet from the side lot line? Building where it is now means I can potentially reuse the existing foundation wall. So first, I just want to clarify that we are not proposing to change the setback in neighborhood residential zones. If that's what you are, there are some tweaks to low-rise zones, but they are predominantly 5-yard setbacks now and in the future. So it's not that we're proposing a change that would change this. The standards for what we call non-conforming structures are a little bit complicated. Generally, if you are tearing down a structure and starting over again, you will need to comply with the 5-foot setback. However, if you are doing modifications to an existing building, there are basically different rules that often allow you to kind of retain that existing setback, and in some cases even expand it. Unfortunately, that's probably as high a detail as I can go into it, but because a lot of it depends on the specifics of the situation. Next question, what is the difference between low-rise 1 and neighborhood residential in terms of specifications, particularly height and lot coverage? So the height in neighborhood residential and low-rise 1 is the same. Rather than 30 feet today, I'm proposing to increase that to 32 feet to allow those better floor-to-ceiling heights. Neighborhood residential would have a lot coverage of 50%. Low-rise zones don't have a lot coverage. They are instead regulated by FAR and by an amenity area requirement, as well as other things like the green factor requirement that requires trees and landscaping to some degree. There are other differences between those zones. Low-rise 1 has a slightly higher floor area. It has a slightly higher density. It also has certain exemptions, such as for quarter lots, that make it different. But those are the high-level differences between them. If you want to, again, on our website, we have the Updating Seattle's Neighborhood Residential Zoning, which has a kind of a detailed list of the development standards. And we also have a low-rise development standards chart, which kind of so you can compare them more directly. The next question says, could you explain unit lot subdivision in a neighborhood center? Is it similar to short platting? What is the maximum number of units for a 6,000 square foot lot? So unit lot subdivision is something that only changes the lots, basically the location of the lots on the map, so that they can be sold separately. In that case, it's very different than short plat, which is, or a subdivision, in which they are totally separated. The major difference is that a short plat or a subdivision, when that happens, the development standards apply to each of the lots separately. That means that the setbacks would apply on each of those individual lots. So if you have a 6,000 square foot lot, today the setbacks only apply to the outside of that. If you divide it into 4 lots, then each of those lots has to meet setback standards from each of the other ones. In a unit lot subdivision, the lot as a whole is called the parent lot. The existing lot is the parent lot, and then it creates unit lot subdivisions for the purpose of resale. In a unit lot subdivision, the parent lot has to meet the development standards as a whole, and then rather than the unit lots. So that means the big difference there is if you from that 6,000 square foot lot, the parent lot would have to meet the setback standards, but the units within it could be attached. They wouldn't have any separation from each other. Unit lot subdivision in that sense can actually it is separate from a construction permit, and it can actually come after the construction permit, since you're really it's just for the purposes of resale. So in terms of the maximum number of units, if you do a unit lot subdivision, the number of units on the lot is regulated for the parent as a whole, and so it doesn't change based on whether you unit lot subdivision at all. Again, if you're in the neighborhood residential zone, that would be on a 6,000 square foot lot, that would be 4 units. If you chose to subdivide it or short plat into 4 units, then each of those units could have 1 unit on it. But it would depend on how you do it. If you have 1, large unit and then 3 smaller units, that it would be a little bit different.
And Brandon, if I could, can you hear me?
Yep.
Just wanted to chime in. It looks like this person is asking about a location within a neighborhood center. It's probably important to point out neighborhood residential will not be a zone that's applied inside neighborhood centers. It would be a more intensive zone, starting with low rise 1 and perhaps higher density low rise 2, low rise 3, or other zones. So the unit lot subdivision, if it were a townhome development, it could be a factor that is part of that development. But if it were something like a flat, small to mid-sized apartment building, the unit lot subdivision itself wouldn't be part of that development process. Very, very likely would not, and wouldn't come into play. So you're really differentiating. It really depends on the type of development and how it relates to the underlying lot.
Yeah, and thank you so much. And just to be clear there, unit lot subdivision is not different in neighborhood centers versus other areas. It's the same process with the same standards. And again, in those neighborhood centers, the number of units you'd be allowed would be based on the zoning there, and it wouldn't change based on whether you wanted to do a unit lot subdivision. The next question is, what is the definition of multifamily? Is that the same as middle housing in HB 1110? So the city actually doesn't have a definition of multifamily, yeah, so I think that's the case, but certainly going forward, we're not proposing to have one. There are multifamily zones, which are different than neighborhood residential zones. Multifamily zones include low-rise zones, mid-rise zones, and high-rise zones. but those are zones, not a definition. Multifamily, there is no kind of commonly agreed to definition of multifamily. There's also isn't a commonly agreed definition of family. And so I think, that's why we tend to avoid that. I mean, I think colloquially, people tend to think of multifamily as anytime there are multiple units, but sometimes it also can be, multiple families living within the same building. So it can be defined differently by different people. HB 1110 does define middle housing, though, which I think is similar. For them, middle housing is any housing that is in a 3-story context or less, and that can be detached homes, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, apartments and condos, cottage housing, and a wide variety of basically kind of all kinds of things in a 3-story context. Okay, the next question, if no or sufficient off-street parking is required for a lot for the new development, does the plan propose residents will be able to move to electric vehicles and charge those vehicles? Okay, so I guess the first question there is, are people required to have electric chargers on site? So if you are required to have parking, or if you choose to have parking, the city does require that a portion of those are required to be electric chargers. In general, if it's 4 or less units, it's all of the units have to have have to be EV ready, so they have to have the capacity for people to put their charger in there. In larger buildings, it's a portion. I believe it's generally kind of 45% of parking spaces in multifamily, and I think it's a little less in commercial buildings. I guess the question really there is about what will happen if there is no or less. And so, yes, I think that is, that's going to be different for all people. Some people will choose to park on a street or choose to charge at a work site. And so that is also a trade-off. If there's less parking spaces, those are potentially less places to charge a vehicle. What is the definition of principal dwelling unit? So a principal dwelling unit is any dwelling unit that is not accessory to another dwelling unit. So dwelling units are, by their nature are principal unless they become accessory. And so the point at which somebody declares them to be accessory to another structure, then they are no longer principal. And so, obviously the difference is an accessory dwelling unit can't be, has to always be on the same lot as the principal, and it is subject to certain limitations. But there are also some benefits to being an accessory dwelling unit as well, in terms of different standards for when street improvements might be required or parking, for example. Next question. How do the proposed changes in zoning compare to changes that have occurred in the past 50 years? Is this the largest proposed change in zoning in Seattle's modern history in terms of affected parcels? How do these changes compare to what is being done in other cities in Washington state, or is what is happening out of state? So first, yeah, I mean, in terms of the last 50 years, the city has not really taken on big changes to zoning. In fact, the kind of the biggest changes to zoning that happened in that period, some of them have been, there's only been a couple of really big citywide zone changes. One in the 70s, we actually downzoned areas. Then in 2019, the city implemented mandatory housing affordability, which implemented kind of small increases in height that were offset by a requirement for a mandatory housing affordability requirement that projects would have to provide on-site or pay into a fund to create affordable units. So in most areas, those were very small. In some areas, those were larger. Outside of those, changes have generally been in kind of small areas, smaller areas, I should say, on a case-by-case basis, especially in individual places where light rail stations have happened, or places like South Lake Union, or in parts of downtown. So probably, given that we had, most of our zoning is the same zoning we've had, since the 50s, that this probably is larger in terms of the number of affected parcels than other things we've done in the last 50 years. In terms of, Michael?
Brendan, can I chime in? I just want
Yeah.
to provide a little bit more. It's very hard to compare different waves of zoning change. I think you're underrepresenting what I would say there were some significant zoning changes even within the context of what I like to think is the plan that the city adopted under the Growth Management Act in the early 1990s established those areas, namely urban centers and urban villages, that were intended to accommodate nearly all of the city's growth in the succeeding 20 years. There were a series of phases of implementing those urban villages and centers over the next really couple of decades. Some of them were more significant than others. One, for example, was the redesignation of South Lake Union from what had been more of an employment center to more of a mixed-use, true regional center. There were zoning changes there. Obviously, that created a lot more new housing resulted from that. That was one of the more significant ones. Brennan is right, as the sound transit system has been, locations for new stations became established. We did different phases, mostly within those urban villages, applied higher density zones over time. So kind of a phased implementation of the initial comprehensive plan. I would say that what we are doing with this comprehensive plan update is at scale with the cumulatively what was done to implement the first comprehensive plan, and probably bigger in terms of the total number of units. But similar efforts. But the key thing here from our perspective is that the early 90s plan really hasn't been substantially changed in terms of generally the locations of allowed growth in the city up to today. And so by expanding some of those centers, identifying new centers around light rail, the neighborhood centers, and then the changes to our single family, well, historically would have been single family zones to allow middle housing, cumulatively is certainly, I think, more than all that was done to implement the original plan. But that also was a big effort as well.
Yeah, and I think maybe the really important context is that about 2/3 of the city is zoned neighborhood residential, and we, haven't done a really major update of the neighborhood residential zones probably in the last 50 years. And so anytime you're updating the neighborhood residential zone, that probably means, it's the largest portion of our city. And so in terms of number of effective parcels, it's going to be large. And then second question, part of that question is, how does this compare to what's being done in other cities in Washington state? Obviously, under HB 1110, cities, basically every city except for really small ones across the 3-county region, is having to go through this at the same time. So this is very consistent in many respects to what a lot of other people are doing. In terms of the amount of change, a lot of cities are actually seeing a much bigger change to their single family zones because they're starting from a baseline of allowing much less development than Seattle. There are other cities, though, that have already been doing this work, that have been doing the work ahead of time, that have already gone forward, allowing a variety of zones. So, I think in terms of that change, like this is what's happening in places across the entire state, and that for other cities, it really varies from being a much bigger change than Seattle is doing to a much smaller, given the specific circumstances of each city.
And I would say in developing this comprehensive plan and the concepts you see in our proposed growth strategy, there are other cities which we consider peer cities of similar size, the cities with a history of strong growth, housing and jobs, similar to Seattle, that are doing similar things. The idea of focusing more density around a wider range of transit options, light rail, bus rapid transit, and bus transit. the concept of identifying smaller nodes for distributing density and more housing diversity in more neighborhoods, what we are calling neighborhood centers. And there are actually some other cities that use the same term, talk about neighborhood centers as well, or call them other things. Vancouver, BC, I know it's not in the US, but doing a very similar, I think very bold comprehensive plan. They just updated their plan. Looks quite similar. They're also taking steps to allow middle housing similar to what our HB 1110 has done here. So there are definitely peer cities that have doing very similar things to Seattle, Portland, Vancouver, Minneapolis, other cities across the country that we learn lessons from, and hopefully they learn from us as well.
Yeah, and very close to home, Tacoma has been doing this work, and it kind of started a little farther ahead than we are. Next question. How effective have the tree preservation requirements you just stated been in preserving trees in lots under development since the tree ordinance took effect in July 2023? Does the city have that data? It looks as if most lots are clear cut completely. So the city does track. Since then, we have been tracking what's been happening on sites. There's a map that kind of shows for kind of sites that have developed what's happening. It's hard to say very much since July of 2023. It takes a long time for development to happen. Permits often take more than a year by themselves. And so if the rules just went in July of 2023, then it only applied to permits that are coming in after that point. So there's very few that have even been, finished, and certainly none have been actually constructed yet. So it's a little bit hard to say at this point. But we do obviously want to review those periodically to revisit them. The next question. What you have presented is one Seattle plan in the future. What about the current zoning questions? I'm afraid I don't understand what that means. So maybe if you can.
I'll take a stab. I'll take a stab at it, and I might understand that there could be some confusion between the 20-year plan and the zoning proposal that is currently out for public review and comment. So the plan is future oriented. It is designed to accommodate growth over 20 years and beyond. When we update the plan, and this is also pursuant to state law, we have to adopt the zoning that anticipates that long range, that long-term growth now, ahead of when the growth will occur. So yes, it's a plan for the future, but the zoning for that future is the zoning that we are asking for you to comment on, are all of the zoning changes in our neighborhood residential, in our neighborhood centers, and the other locations we've been talking about. I hope that I'm taking a guess at what you might be asking about how these two things relate to each other.
Great question. Next question I will take a crack at, then hand over to you, Michael. It says, when reviewing comments and feedback, what increases chance of incorporation? And then question, number, frequency of specific feedback, question mark. I'll just say that there isn't kind of one thing that increases or decreases the chance of incorporation. I mean, I think it's important for us not just to hear what you'd like to have happen, but why. If there are local circumstances that kind of suggest this area is different and should be treated differently, that's very helpful. So I think both kind of just explaining both what the change you're looking for clearly, and why, and if there's local circumstances that suggest that's especially appropriate in a specific location, that's very helpful. I don't know if Michael, maybe you have more to add on that.
Yeah, I think just building on that, and I agree. There isn't a magic bullet to any individual comment guaranteeing that it gets incorporated into the plan or the zoning. What I would say is being aware of and to take a look at that part of our descriptions of the plan and descriptions of the zoning that focus on the goals and the objectives that we're trying to achieve, which largely focus on responding to our housing supply and affordability crisis by providing new options for housing across the city, but also talk about many other goals and objectives for the city in terms of maintaining and enhancing livability, protecting the environment, ensuring you can get around the city by different ways, not just a single occupant automobile, climate change, all of those goals. So what we're seeking to do is balance the need to provide the housing we need in the future, but also achieving those other goals. So when you craft a comment, keep those in mind, and a productive suggested changes should be ones that would enhance our ability to meet those goals.
Great. Next question. Why is LR3 proposed on arterials that don't have infrastructure or amenities nearby? Won't allowing LR3 development all along arterials slow the arterials and create problems moving transit along those arterials? So I guess the first question, the first question is, do arterials have less infrastructure and amenities? Obviously there's a lot of different things that go into infrastructure. There's transportation, there's utilities, there's a lot of things that go into amenities. In terms of infrastructure, arterials actually have to have more in the way of infrastructure than other areas. Those are often where kind of trunk lines for utilities go. So they have more in that sense. They also have more in terms of transportation options. Obviously, there was one of the major reasons the zoning occurs or proposing on frequent transit routes is because transit is an infrastructure or an amenity that that is along that, and so we are located thus closer to those things. Arterials also tend to have more sidewalks than other areas. In terms of amenities, arterials also do tend to have more in terms of shops and services. Maybe less parks, although parks are kind of all over the place. So I don't think that is true as a rule, certainly. Maybe there might be some areas where some parts of arterials that might have less. If those are places you think that if there are places you don't think on those arterials that are better or worse, those are great things to provide comments on. The other one is about won't allowing development on arterials slow the arterials and create problems moving transit along those arterials. We did bring in transportation modelers to look at some of this. They have not suggested that that is something they're concerned about. Obviously people, people who are driving around tend to drive onto the arterials anyway. And so, whether it's from a driveway or it's from a street, vehicles tend to go to arterials for trips anyway. And we've not been informed that, people, getting directly onto arterials rather than going on a street and then onto arterials is substantially different in terms of traffic on streets.
Yeah, Brendan, let me just add two quick points to that. I think the transit part is really key here too. These aren't just any arterials. These are arterials that are served by our frequent transit network. So these are a higher level of transit service. And with regard to is what Brendan was just talking about is what might be the impact on traffic along the streets. Growth that has close proximity to using transit is going to promote alternatives to single occupancy vehicles, and so will, in the aggregate, help to relieve the traffic along those arterials because there are fewer cars on the road. And with respect to the access to amenities, housing on the transit routes, using the transit to get to other centers or locations where there are a rich mix of amenities, it will be a relatively short transit ride to get to a nearby urban center or neighborhood center. And the transit then helps to create that accessibility for people who are going to live in the housing along our transit arterials. So transit is the link there.
Next question is, will the DEIS address the expected traffic impacts from all this new development? Will this information be available before the City Council takes actions? So DEI stands for Draft Environmental Impact Statement. We released the draft in March, so it is already out to the public. It does have a whole transportation section, which includes, the results of transportation modeling on traffic. So that is included in the DEIS. We will also include an updated one that looks at the kind of preferred alternative, which is the growth strategy that we talked about today, and that will be included in a final EIS. And yes, that will be available in January so that the council can see that before they take action. Next question, why is any increased density focused on areas that have already borne the burden of upzoning and growth, like the central area and the Rainier Valley? And then secondly, what is the city's plan to prevent large property tax increases and displacement? So I think that's a little confusing to me. Most of the rezones we're proposing about are actually in the opposite. They are focused in areas that haven't had substantial upzoning and growth. If you look at Rainier Valley in specific, we're proposing a bunch of new neighborhood centers, and only one of those is in that whole kind of quadrant of the city. The new neighborhood centers are primarily in areas that have not had that upzoning and growth. So that is essentially kind of one of the purposes here is to create more opportunities in other areas of the city for housing. The second question there is, what is the city's plan to prevent large property tax increases and displacement? So on the first one of property tax increases, so property tax increases occur, property tax is based on your assessed value, which is based on what the assessor thinks housing could be sold for. In the short term, well, I won't go into property tax too much. It's very complicated. But one, the city does have a property tax lid. So if all parts of the city become slightly more valuable, then that lid prevents the city from increasing property taxes. So while what was likely to happen is we could see some increases in property taxes where there are larger upzones if the assessor sees that those parcels are actually going for more money on a local basis. But then because of the property tax lid, that would mean that relatively that property taxes would not increase as quickly in other areas. So overall, that's the kind of the overall thing that stops property tax increases from occurring across the city because of zoning. Obviously, we as a city have seen big property tax increases in the past and may in the future. Those are based on a wide variety of things. One of those are the levies that we've passed. So there's a lot of things that go into that. In terms of displacement, we do have an anti-displacement strategies report, which outlines the programs that we already have, and the mayor's office is now working to kind of revisit those to see what's working and look for additional strategies that can help address the displacement that's already occurring. I don't know if Michael, you have anything.
Brennan, it's perhaps worth at least quickly noting the several property tax deferral or assistance programs that the county makes available to the residents of Seattle.
Yes, and there's two of those. There's a property tax deferral for seniors. So seniors can defer their property taxes. And then there's also a low-income property tax exemption so that certain low-income people don't pay property taxes. The next question. Short-term rentals are defined in HB 1337 as a lodging use, not a residential use. Are you planning to prohibit short-term rentals in ADUs in neighborhood residential areas so that the new housing units can be available to city residents? So the city currently does have restrictions on short-term rentals. We are not proposing to change those. Those do allow people to do short-term rentals in ADUs with certain limits. And again, we're not proposing to change that, and nor, obviously, it's important to note that, people create ADUs for a wide variety of things. Many of those are rented, many of them are not, and some of them are for family members. And so so we're not planning to kind of prohibit short-term rentals. Is like it's a short story. Why do you place LR3 buildings right next door to single-family homes in plans? I'm also not sure what that means. Obviously, the city doesn't build any buildings, nor do we buy property to have other people build them. So I'm not sure what this is. I don't know if maybe there was an image somewhere that showed one somewhere, but I'm afraid I don't know what that is.
Brennan, I'm gonna wave my magic wand here and try to interpret the question a little bit. I'm fairly sure that the person is asking about, and this is the case in many areas, that either in the zoning proposal for neighborhood centers or along the frequent transit arterials, as we were discussing, the proposed zoning is low-rise 3, which can be up to a maximum of 5 stories. And in some cases, the transition is directly to neighborhood residential, either across a lot line if it's along a transit arterial, or across the street, typically if it's the zoning proposed for a neighborhood center. So I think the question there is why that transition directly from LR3 to neighborhood residential, from a 5-story zone to a 3-story zone.
Great. Yeah. So in neighborhood centers, we are not proposing any transitions where an LR3 zoning would be on the same block as a kind of there's a 3-story or zone. So that's because those areas are larger. We can avoid that. That does happen on the frequent transit routes, and the idea there is basically just because it is a small area of change, that it results in transitions that are greater within those blocks. And I think the idea was just there was a balance about wanting to create more housing around frequent transit, but not wanting to but limiting the extent to which that affects adjacent areas.
And within the neighborhood centers, the primary goal or objective there is provide housing opportunities, especially opportunities for more diverse housing, such as stacked flats, which generally are going to be much more likely in the low-rise 3 zone than in either low-rise 2 or low-rise 1, which are more likely to get townhomes. We did use the low-rise 2 zone in some places where the configuration of the neighborhood center provided one block that could be neighborhood low-rise 3, an adjacent block low-rise 2, and then stepping down to neighborhood residential in the surrounding area. There are examples of that, and we took that opportunity to step down the density. But in many places, there is a low-rise 3, but across an entire street, and then the next block would be the neighborhood residential. And it's really a balancing act, really depending on which neighborhood center and how the blocks were configured, and keeping our eye on achieving a mix of zones that provided substantial new housing opportunities.
Great. Well, next question. When you rezone from NR, neighborhood residential, to NC, which could either be neighborhood commercial or neighborhood center, how do you calculate the building height based on the street width? If the street width is 30 feet, what is the maximum building height could be built? Okay, so first of all, just a clarification. So NC here could mean neighborhood commercial, which is a zone, or it could mean neighborhood centers, which are place types on the growth strategy. A neighborhood center is not a zone. But I think the important thing is that in the city, the building heights aren't based on the street width; they're based on the lot. So the height in a specific zone would be based on what the requirements of that zone are. In an area with no parking strips to provide street trees, will there be a requirement for a developer to provide trees near public sidewalks and roadways to preserve tree canopy lost through development? Okay, so maybe the background here is that in many areas, so in many of the areas of the city, there are curbs, and we call the area on the far side of the curb the planting strip, which I think maybe some people call a parking strip, but you can't park on it. And those are typically where street trees are provided. In many areas of the city do not have curbs, and so there is no kind of planting strip, and cars can park all over the place, and so street trees are not typically located there. With new development, though, there could be an opportunity there. We require curbs as part of development in many areas, including almost all development in regional urban centers. So when development occurs in those areas, developers are required to put in curbs. That creates a space for a tree can be planted. In other areas, we don't always require a curb. In that case, there's no opportunity for a developer to plant a tree as part of development. But no, the proposal is not that if there's no place that we would allow them to plant a tree that they would be required to plant a tree somewhere else. Obviously, there are tree planting requirements on private property, so they're always going to have trees on their private property. But in addition, we require street trees when we can accommodate them in the right of way. Does the comp plan update consider alternatives to creating housing need related to job growth, as Mike mentioned? If Seattle companies prioritized hiring locally, or if we embraced work from home and technology that didn't require relocation to the area, shouldn't such policies be considered in the plan as reducing housing units actually needed? Michael, do you want to take that?
Yeah, that's a bit of a complicated question. I'll start at kind of a philosophical level just to begin with, which is our goal and responsibility in planning for growth in the city is first and foremost that we can accommodate the housing growth and the housing demand that might occur over the next 20 years. It is true, and I think we especially learned during the recent pandemic, that the locations and the way in which the people may want to live, where they may be commuting from or not commuting from can change. But we also know through a long history of observing growth in the city that there is a relationship between housing demand and job growth, and we want to plan responsibly for that. And we know that Seattle has been a favored location for a really vibrant economy generally, and some large employers that have added lots of jobs in relatively rapid fashion. And we want to provide housing nearby that can meet that demand. We monitor over time how growth occurs, where jobs are located, where housing gets built, and we learn from that. Even during this pandemic, which with a rise in work from home, there was still a very strong demand for housing inside the city. It didn't all go to North Bend or to Marysville, although I'm sure there were some individuals that did relocate or worked remotely from there. Housing demand has been really strong here. We expect the housing demand and the economic growth to be strong in the city over the next 20 years, and we feel like it's the responsibility of the city to plan for that. One area where work from home is likely going to be a factor is not so much housing, but transportation, and it's something we work closely with SDOT to collect the best available data to plan for transportation of these facilities that address the evolving needs of people to get around the city on a daily basis. Some of that is the need for more connectivity within neighborhoods to get to shops and services and amenities nearby, as some people are working partially from home and then part of the time commuting to a major employment center like downtown. I'd say that's an area where there's a little bit more of an impact on the changing patterns of where people live and work.
Great. On a frequent transit route that is not in a regional, urban, or neighborhood center, is the upzoning limited to a half block away from the frequent transit street? It's actually less than that. It is currently the current proposal is only to apply rezones to sites that are lots that are directly abutting a frequent transit street or are within 100 feet, 100 feet of a transit street. So it's generally kind of one parcel along the street, and for those ones that are parallel to the street, it might be a couple. What is
and Brandon, I'm gonna, in many cases where the long face of the block, if you will, is against the arterial street, it does end up being a half block. But if the blocks are arranged in a different way, it may be far less than a half block. So it really depends on the block itself. But Brendan is right. It's one parcel or the equivalent of a parcel about 100 feet deep off the arterial in any of those scenarios.
What is your plan for having so many units on these lots regarding our power grids, sewer lines, shear congestion that will occur? I am speaking of the West Seattle End-Line plan. Even having that many cars per lot charging will tax our infrastructure when power and sewer in place were set to accommodate single family. So as part of this work, we conducted an environmental impact statement. And as part of that, we looked at both transportation, the utilities. We worked with each of those departments to understand kind of their existing plans and the impact of these different changes, and whether there's an issue. One by one, in terms of the power grid, Seattle City Light has already been planning for substantial growth in the city, and they feel that they have enough, be a process that will continue to create power and that can allow them to plan for, changes to the transmission distribution lines that are needed as they go. In terms of sewer lines, similarly, we worked with SPU. They have obviously capacity at the treatment facilities, and they have a process for improving distribution lines as needed as we go. Obviously, and then the connections to those lines are largely paid for by developers, and so they're that's not a problem for them. Their biggest issue actually is paying for the maintenance on and upgrades to the existing system. Our system is very old, and so they're much more concerned about having the funds in order to be able to do that work. And as they do that, they can adjust the new things they put in to account for that. And then in transportation, obviously, part of this is there is modeling that went on. Obviously, we're not creating new streets, we're not widening streets, and so we will, as a city, have to figure out ways to make better use of transit, biking, and walking. Obviously, part of this work is actually making it easier for people to live in places that have shops and services nearby, so they can do more by walking and biking and transit. But Seattle Department of Transportation also has the Seattle Transportation Plan, which has a lot of detail about their process for responding to this and making better use of our streets. Michael, the next one's for you. Who is the Seattle Planning Commission? Is this a volunteer group? What was the process for being in this group? Does the group represent all stakeholders? What is the say influence on the final plan?
Okay, I'm not going to be able to answer all of the details regarding the Planning Commission, but I can respond to each of these questions. So first of all, the Seattle Planning Commission is a volunteer advisory body to the city. The city has a number of citizens advisory groups, and the Planning Commission is one of them. It is a very important and long-standing one at the city that was created by council ordinance quite some time ago. The process for being part of this group it involves an application periodically, as there's a term limitation on the current members of the Planning Commission, and as seats become available, there's an application process that residents of the city can apply to be members of the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission is actually staffed in the same offices as the Office of Planning and Community Development, and there's a dedicated staff to the commission. There is a range of perspectives, and including stakeholder categories that the Planning Commission is designed to, and where they strive to fill seats that meet those specifications. Stakeholders like people from the development community, or renters, folks who are familiar with environmental policy, design professionals, and others. And then let me see, what was the next question? The influence on the final plan. Unlike many other cities, the Planning Commission in Seattle is a purely advisory body. Some other cities, particularly smaller, more suburban cities in the region, tend to have planning commissions that have more of a procedural role in approving and furthering and sending legislation to council. Our Planning Commission does not. What they have done is followed very closely this comprehensive plan update, produced a series of white papers both before we started doing this update, reviewed early drafts, provide comment letters, and other analyses that have informed the work of the staff of OPCD in developing the plan, and continue to serve as a key stakeholder body as the plan goes to council and is implemented over time. They call themselves the stewards of the comprehensive plan, actually, and I say that's a good description. They try to steward this process as an advisory body, and they have come up with some great ideas that we've incorporated over time.
Great. Next question is for you, Michael. This is actually about state law. For cities like Redmond, with a 2020 census population of 73,500 that just missed the Tier 1 designation under HB 1110, when, after they reach 75,000, will they be required to meet Tier 1 standards?
Oh boy, this is where we need a state staff person to answer a question like this. I actually don't. I hesitate to tell you definitively when and for those who are this refers to the different levels of requirement under House Bill 1110. It is. I'm going to guess, and we'd have to do some more research too. It would be something. I think it is when at the next the Office of Financial Management releases population estimates and forecasts ahead of each of the 10-year comprehensive plan update cycles. I suspect it's when we go into the next update cycle that they would be, if they do increase in population, they'd become a Tier 1 city. But I'd have to go research that to give you a definitive answer. It wouldn't happen next year. It's periodically over some period of time.
In October 2024, a phase 1 NR update was released, and comment deadline was set for December 20th. Will a phase 2 update be released, and what is the comment deadline for phase 2? So the comment, we're going to say it's one comment period for phase 1 and phase 2. So on that same October, we also released the zoning maps, which are the core part of phase 2. And so it has the same comment period that also goes through December 20th. They only become separated when we send them to council as legislation. This can be another one for you, Michael. This plan results in capacity for 330,000 units plus the undisclosed additions in phase 3. Is that correct? How much will be added in phase 3, recognizing that in the past, much less capacity enabled Seattle to grow at a high rate, and it is well documenting that upzoning reduces affordability. So some comments in there as well as a question.
Yeah. And can you hear me? Okay, by the way, I'm having a little bit of connectivity problem. I'm going to leave my camera off just in case I hit a glitch here. So we don't know how much capacity will be proposed with the increase in zoning as part of phase 3. We anticipate it could be a substantial number, but that proposal has not been developed. And I should say what you're likely going to see is a range of alternative proposals that would be studied in additional environmental analysis. Supplemental EIS is what we anticipate would be done similar to the EIS that was done for the main comprehensive plan, where we studied 5 different alternatives. There will be 1 to several alternatives studied in the SEIS, and they may have different amounts of growth or different scales of upzoning that will be studied. I would say, with regard to looking in the rearview mirror and seeing what happened over the last 10 plus years in terms of growth in the city, I think what we have seen is that, yes, we grew much faster than was anticipated, but to achieve that growth, we also saw the development of a large portion of the development sites that were more feasible to accommodate new housing and new jobs, and we are rapidly running out of many of the sites that were easier to develop, particularly in key locations. That just makes sense from an economic standpoint, from a land availability standpoint, that some of the easier sites get opened up for development first. And so we're certainly concerned about, if we don't make changes to zoning to add capacity now, that we're really going to hit a logjam and being able to accommodate growth into the future. And I do note the comment at the end about upzoning reducing affordability. That's certainly not our observation or assumption. We feel that, and we feel like there is a clear economic logic to it, and evidence that increasing housing supply in a metropolitan area like Seattle will have a positive impact on affordability. It may not lower housing prices, but it can help to mitigate the increase so that we don't see the kinds of spikes in prices and rents that we experienced over the last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and I'll just add on that, basically everybody who studies the issue has come to the same conclusion that, you need to have a significant supply of housing in order to address affordability, that not having enough capacity is the primary driver of housing price increases. When UW researcher Greg Colburn looked at this issue, he found that the number one driver of homelessness was housing prices, and it was clear that those parts of the country that have a lot more capacity for housing had much more affordability and lower homelessness ratios. And there's a lot of other studies that all show you have to have capacity to address affordability.
And I do want to add, this is a really important question, and I know it undergirds a lot of the plan and the zoning proposal. It's not just about housing supply, about the overall number. It's also about the location and the types of units that get created in different areas of the city with different types of zoning. Phase 3 is going to focus on our existing regional and urban centers. Many of those locations will be our sort of highest intensity transit investments, like new existing or new light rail stations. We're likely going to be look at taller buildings in those areas. We know from the experience of permitting over the last 5 to 10 years, predominantly we get studio and 1-bedroom apartments that meets the needs of many people, smaller households, singles, couples, very small households, that meets their needs. The other areas that we are covering for increased housing supply in phase 1 and phase 2 are meeting the needs of other households. More affordable 2 and 3-bedroom units that can be more affordable home ownership options. Small to mid-sized units in more of a neighborhood context, where there's more of a walking distance that meets the needs and the desires of folks. Now, they don't want to live downtown or on Capitol Hill, but have an affordable housing option in a different neighborhood of the city. So different products for different folks, and overall providing supply that reduces the pressure that's causing the inflation in housing price.
Great, Michael, another one for you. Is there any plan for annexing Skyway? It's more connected to Seattle than Renton.
There's a little background on that question. So Skyway is an unincorporated area. It is adjacent to the city. There is actually a framework for planning for annexations and for allowing them to occur that happens at a body called the Growth Management Planning Council. It's a regional governance body. The GMPC has designated Skyway as a potential annexation area for the city of Renton. So not Seattle. So we don't have currently any plans to, and we don't talk about Skyway in the comprehensive plan. There are areas such as North Highline, which are major potential annexation areas for the city of Seattle and are recognized by the Growth Management Planning Council. So we don't have any plans right now with regard to Skyway. That could change way down the line if Renton didn't want Skyway anymore, and maybe the city decided we were interested in annexing that. Theoretically, that could happen, but that's not what the plan is right
now. Next question is, why keep neighborhood residential zoning at all? Why not just upzone the entire city to low rise and let the market decide what should be a residential or urban center? So you certainly have gotten comments to that nature, but obviously that's not our proposal. The idea is we are trying to locate housing closer to transit and shops and services. That's the idea of both the neighborhood center proposal to kind of push locate more housing in those areas and along frequent transit routes. Obviously there are pros and cons of each choice. That approach could help create a lot more housing, which could address our affordability issues, but it also could result in in housing that's not as close to frequent transit and shops and services, and it might not create those kind of walkable centers. Next one is a group of questions and comments. So first is, in the upzone Central District and South End, upzone homeowners have had additional tax to deal with other than the levies. It's a state law called taxing for highest and best use. If your single family home can now accommodate a 7-story apartment because of upzoning, once those apartments are built on your street, the comps kick in and you'll be taxed for the potential of your lot rather than the single family home you already have. This is a huge driver of displacement. What can the city do to mitigate displacement that results from the highest and best use tax that has disproportionately burdened former red line and distressed communities? So first of all, the city's tax approach is not highest and best use. It actually is based on the assessed value of your house. So it will look at other houses in the neighborhood and both in terms of the comparables, the size of your home, the size of your lot, as well as the zoning, and then they'll use that to try and understand what they think you could sell your property for. So it's actually based on estimated sales price. Obviously, that zoning is one of those factors. In places where, but in a place, even if it's zoned for 7 stories, if the assessor thinks that the most likely person who would buy it would be a person who live in it, then that zoning won't necessarily change your home. But obviously, if that is if developers would be willing to pay a lot more for that property, that would increase your assessed value. But it's not based exclusively on the highest and best use. But obviously the increase in property taxes can be difficult for those people. So I think one of the things we're trying to do, again, is the proposal here is actually to put more capacity for housing in places that are not in places like the South End, but rather located in other parts of the city, so that there are more opportunities for housing in other areas as well. Yeah, and then I think we have talked a little bit about the displacement, anti-displacement strategies, and the things that go in that, and the tax exemptions and deferrals as well.
And the only thing I would add to that, Brennan, is there are the city is quite interested in developing a wider array of tools to provide assistance, be it technical or providing access to financing or other economic resources to enable existing homeowners who are in an area where the zoning would allow it. And quite frankly, our neighborhood residential zone, either the lowest density zone going into the future, will have development opportunities on individual lots up to that 4-unit or maybe even a higher level. And then it could be even higher if zoned to a non-residential zone. But in either of those scenarios, enabling existing homeowners to be a participant in the development process. If there is an opportunity for them to add units on their property and remain in their home or redevelop and live in one of the new units, those are scenarios we would like to enable and find resources and tools that could help with that. So that's a general goal the city has. Say the tools to do that effectively are in development. We have, we try to do similar things with accessory dwelling units, for example, is provide assistance to homeowners who might want to add an accessory dwelling unit. So that is a goal in an area that the city sees itself working in an anti-displacement frame going into the future.
Great. Next question. What is the development potential in NC zoning of 6,000 square foot lot? So in terms of zoning, NC stands for neighborhood commercial. There are multiple different neighborhood commercial zones. So to find out the development potential of a specific zone, you need to find out which one that is. The most important thing, it has a height limit in it. So like an NC 55 zone is a zone that would allow a height of 55 feet. So kind of generally 5 stories. And then you could also look at based on that zone, you can also look at the tables for the amount of floor area to figure that out. So again, it would depend on the specific zone. The next question is, neighborhood commercial 55 is a new zoning code for this specific address. Can developers request up to 10 feet taller than 55 feet? Could SDCI approve it? What is the process to make sure it is reasonable to change is already the maximum zoned height? Okay, so there are very limited ways people can change the height. You can come in for a contract rezone. To do that, you have to prove that a different zone is actually more appropriate for your site. That happens pretty rarely, and it's very expensive and complicated. So it doesn't. Yeah, so that's why it happens very regularly. There are 2 other provisions that potentially are bonuses. There's the Living Building Pilot Program, which allows up to 20 projects to get some additional height if they meet the Living Building Pilot Program, which is a very, very kind of high bar for environmental design. But again, there's only 5 more allowed by that pilot, and so it's again very infrequent. And then lastly, the religious organizations can get some additional height if they are doing 100% affordable buildings. So there isn't some process by which developer can just say, I'd rather have 65 feet and then get it approved. But there are those kind of other limited exceptions that happen very infrequently. You just mentioned locations are considered. Why are Magnolia and Enderline part of this development plan? Neither area are on a majority used transit route or are easy access. So the overall things that went into considering the location of neighborhood centers were a variety of things. 1, the degree of transit access. 2, the level of local shops and services. 3, geographic spread. As we were talking about, we want to make sure that kind of neighborhoods throughout the city have a range of housing options so that people can find a housing that works for them in the places where they want to live. And then we also did, to a lesser extent, look at kind of local things like, are there, major barriers or highways or amounts of ECAs that would make development there difficult. So those are the kinds of things that we balanced. Obviously both those areas have some pros and cons. Which I don't know if we go into, obviously Magnolia has a really established downtown business district. It's an area of almost entirely single family or neighborhood residential zoning. So that would create a lot more, opportunities there. Endline is on the C line. It has an existing kind of shops and services there. Certainly, there are other reasons that are, they're that on that scale things that aren't as good, and so those are the kinds of things we had to balance.
And Brendan, I would also, I think this is also relating back to the earlier question about the experience of the questioner to the city's history of focusing density in certain areas where it was having impacts on communities such as Southeast Seattle. The other thing the Endline and Magnolia have in common is that these are areas of the city that have not had a diversity of zoned housing types and have that would be precisely the kinds of areas we would seek to create opportunities for new types of housing, denser housing, so that the responsibility and the choice for people who want to live in Seattle is more spread out over more neighborhoods.
Great. Next question. What is the city's plan to ensure that housing is sold at affordable rates rather than market runs? And by affordable, I don't mean 80% AMI in Seattle. That's now over $100,000. What's the plan for workers and families earning half that? So the city has a number of different programs that help to ensure lower cost affordable housing. Obviously, one of the big ones is that we have the levy, which allows for the city to, work with nonprofits to create affordable units. We also have the mandatory housing affordability requirements. So for properties that are, multifamily and commercial properties, including those ones that we're rezoning now, to those, they would be required to meet that requirement. Either they have to set aside a portion of units on site as affordable, or that they have to pay into a fund, which can then be mixed with other incentives to create even more units. And we also have the multifamily tax exemption. It's a tax exemption for new development if they set aside a portion of units as affordable. So those are the ways that we get affordable units. Obviously, increasing the supply of housing is really critical in order to prevent the price increases that we've been seeing across the board. We don't have a proposal for kind of taking existing buildings and saying that they now have to be sold at different rates. That probably wouldn't be legal. But those are the ways that we get affordable units in the city. There's a thank you. We appreciate it. Happy to talk. And then last question on here. When will MHA suffixes be added to the upzone proposals? So the idea is that we're going to, the comment period ends on December 20th. We're going to read through all those comments, consider all of them. We're going to make changes to the proposal. And then in May of 2025, we will have the phase 2 legislation ready to go to council. At that point, we'll also publish an online map, and that is where each of the zones will have the MHA suffix in there as well. Just for people who maybe aren't aware, so when we apply mandatory housing affordability, there's a kind of a minimum amount that's applied to all multifamily and commercial projects that have that have MHA, which is almost all of them. And but then for properties that get bigger upzones, then there can be higher suffixes, we'll call M1 or M2 suffixes, and with that there are higher MHA requirements. And so the idea is for those sites we're getting larger upzones that they would have larger MHA requirements. What is the city's definition of affordable housing? Can you give us that number? Is it 500,000? So the city defines affordable housing as any site that has a rent and price restriction on it that is limited, so it can only be occupied or purchased by low-income households, and it has to have a covenant so that those things carry forward to the future for at least 50 years. the units, different programs have different price caps. They are generally based on area median income, and but they vary substantially. Area median income is based on, again, what the median household pays or has in terms of income, I mean. And those programs go from programs that have no that are for very, very low, 30% of area income or less, up to as much as 100% of area median income for projects that are home ownership. So it depends an awful lot on the specific AMI target and whether it is a rental or sales. There are very, very limited cases in which we have affordable housing that is actually a sales program. So it's almost entirely rental rates. And again, it depends on that, the specific program that's coming through, et cetera. Why is the city not trying to measure estimated impacts to the city's tree canopy like it did for the ADU EIS? So we do have an estimate of estimates of potential changes in the EIS. I guess the question is, why do we not have a one specific number? Here we're, unlike the ADU EIS, they were looking at kind of adding a very specific thing in the background of a specific project projects. We have there's kind of a much greater variety of zones here that are happening. We do a lot of analysis of like what the impacts might be in neighborhood residential zones. Specifically, there's going to be a lot of modeling on that in the FEIS. But given the variety of circumstances, it's not possible to kind of say it's this one number, given the huge range of things that are happening. The different types of sites we have, the different types of zones. The new regulations we have in place, which say certain trees have to be preserved, other ones have to be replaced on site, and the different types of trees. We now have trees requirements for planting on street trees as well as private property, and so all that is complicated enough that you can't have one number that says what it is. The city has a tree canopy goal of 30% by 2037. How do these proposals track or support that? Well, the city has a plan for trying to meet the 30% goal. It's called the Urban Forest Management Plan. It is, has a wide variety of strategies. It's based on, it's based on both city investments, regulations for private property, and a variety of other things. And so this obviously is, part of sorry. So I guess I don't really know how to answer the question of how does it track. Certainly there are trade-offs to more development. We're trying to meet many goals as a city. That tree canopy goal is just one of many of them, and we're trying to balance those. Yeah. Well, this time we have answered all the questions, so I'm guessing a couple more will be on here, so we can maybe do these last two, and then we'll, since almost 7:30, we'll sign off. Kippy, what about the significant loss of greenscape with this upzoning and its impact on the environment? I think that's a comment that you're concerned about that. Obviously, we are too, and we're trying to balance things. We have a lot of goals in the city, both trying to, address housing affordability and trees and other things. That's why we have a wide variety of regulations to help mitigate the impacts of that. The next one is a question about the EIS. Has the city studied the environmental impacts of this new zoning proposal on killer whale populations and other critical endangered species? And it talks about the benefits of large trees in terms of phytoremediation, filtering, stormwater, cooling, etc., and the needs of different species. So the environmental impact statement does talk about that. It specifically has a section on in critical animals and especially endangered species. Obviously, we have not commissioned a researcher to look at specifically what is the connection between a zone and what that might result and what that might mean in terms of utility things and new stormwater regulations and what that might mean for killer whale populations. But yeah, at a high level, that is part of the environmental impact statement. Great. Well, thank you very much for attending this event. Obviously, the key thing here is that we're looking for public feedback until the end of the day on this Friday. There's a lot more resources on our website if you have more questions you want to look into, but please do submit those comments by the end of the week. You can submit those comments on the mapping tool if you want to locate it in a specific area. There's also a general comment form if you want to have more general comments. And if there's an attachment or something that you need to do, you can also email us at oneseattleplan.zoning@seattle.gov.
And thank you as well to everybody who attended tonight. The only thing I'd add to that is do bear in mind that the next step for the process overall is that we will take in comments, produce a revised set of zoning proposals, and then they go to the City Council in 2025, during which there'll be additional opportunities for public comment.
Great, thank you.
Okay, good night. Thanks, Brennan.